Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family: Deborah, Christy, Tanra, and David. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes and collections found nowhere else, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, we're starting a month of longtime favorites. Those books that I've been reading from for years because they get requested again and again. This week, let's relax with more from a marvelous journey. We're continuing Mount Everest, the Reconnaissance of 1921 by Lieutenant Colonel C.K. Howard Bury, D.S.O., and other members of the Mount Everest expedition, with illustrations and maps. First published in 1922 by Longmans Green & Co., 55 Fifth Avenue, New York, and by Edward Arnold & Co., London. Let's pick up right where we left off as we work our way towards Mount Everest and the beginning of Chapter 5. Let's begin. Chapter 5: The Search for Carta. After leaving Mallory and Bullock to continue the search for a possible route up Mount Everest from the Wrong Book side, Heron and I, on July 5th, started off down the Wrong Book Valley in order to visit Carta. We had been told that it was only 2 days' easy march from the monastery to get there. It was a cold morning when we started off. There had been a sharp frost during the night, and the sun did not reach us till late in the morning. Mount Everest stood out at the head of the valley, wonderfully clear and clothed with a fresh mantle of white. Instead of crossing over the river by the bridge at Chobu, we kept straight on down the valley till we came to Chodzong, where were the first barley fields in cultivation. There was plenty of water here for irrigation purposes, and some fine grassy fields on which many ponies were grazing. We had to change our transport in this village and get fresh animals, so that it was not till 3 o'clock in the afternoon that we got started again. In Tibet, they have a system of stages, and animals from one village are taken as a rule for one stage only. As each stage usually ends at the next village, and as villages are frequent, this is a most awkward and inconvenient arrangement, as it necessitates 3 or 4 changes a day. In order to avoid these constant changes, we used to persuade the villagers by promises of extra bakshish especially where we had a large number of animals to undertake 2 or 3 stages. After leaving Chotsong, we climbed up over a steep pass 1,200 feet above the valley and found a still deeper descent to the village of Ha Lung, which lay at our feet. Here we waited for our transport, but as this did not arrive till dark, we decided to camp there, though we had only done 18 miles from Rongbuk. The yaks travel very slowly. We were now again at 14,800 feet and found a much warmer climate with green barley fields and here and there patches of yellow mustard. A large rhubarb with a curious crinkled leaf grew here and there in the fields. We tried to eat this rhubarb. It had an unpleasant taste, but this disappeared when it was cooked, and it proved a welcome addition to our diet. The Tibetans do not use it for food, as sugar, without which it would be uneatable, is scarce and expensive in this country. The plant serves, however, as an acid for dyes. Ha Lung is a very prosperous-looking village with well-built houses. The villagers soon had 3 tents pitched for us on a grassy field between the village and the river. Cushions, cooking pots, and fuel were also brought out for us. Here we camped for the night in reasonable comfort. On the following morning, the loads were all carried by hand across a fragile bridge over the glacier stream, while the yaks and the ponies were driven across it. We then rode for a mile down the green and well-watered valley, and afterwards turned up into another valley, where every flat space was green with barley fields, intermixed with brilliant patches of yellow from the fields of mustard. A small glacier stream fed this valley and supplied plenty of water for irrigation. After passing several small villages, we rode across a spur also covered with barley fields to Rebu, where we had to change our transport. This was quite a picturesque village situated on a rocky knoll, part of the village being on one side and part on the other of the river. Along the various irrigation canals were wildflowers of all kinds. Monkshood grew there, also black and yellow clematis, rhubarb, ranunculus, and primulas of different kinds. By 10 o'clock our transport was changed, and we were given ponies instead of yaks. They travel much quicker, and we had apparently a long way to go yet before we could reach the next village. We were expecting all the time to get to Karta that evening, but where distances are concerned, all Tibetans are liars, and after doing 26 miles we stopped, Karta being apparently as far off as ever. After leaving Rebu, the path led for some miles up an uninteresting valley, in which limestone cliffs on one side and sandstone cliffs on the other came down almost to the stream, the waters of which, in contrast to the muddy glacier streams that we had been meeting the whole time, were as clear as crystal. There were many small birds along the banks, all of them wonderfully tame. These, when we were resting for lunch, hopped all round us and under our legs, carrying off crumbs or any morsels of food. We now climbed up on the pass called the Doya La, 17,000 feet, from the top of which were fine views of great rocky peaks on either side, those on the south being covered in parts with hanging glaciers. About a quarter of a mile from the top of the pass, we struck some granite soil, on which grew an extraordinary variety of alpine flowers. The blue poppy abounded. Pink, yellow, and white saxifrages covered all the rocks, and besides these were many other plants which I had not seen before and which were quite new to me. The range which we now crossed acts as a barrier against the approach of the monsoon clouds and prevents them from passing over into Tibet. Over on the north side, the country is mostly dry and very little grows there, whereas on the south there is a rich and varied vegetation, and the air feels soft and moist. The road from the pass led by an easy descent into a fine valley, with a green lake lying at its head under the dark cliffs of some bold rocky peaks. We followed this valley for many miles, a strong headwind blowing against us the whole of the time, and found ourselves before long once more among the junipers and willows. We also saw pink and white rhododendrons, and in places a small yellow one with waxy blossoms. The yellow rock cistus, spireas, roses, yellow primulas, blue monkshood, campanulas, blue anemones, and hundreds of other wild flowers formed a rich flora, which showed that a considerable precipitation from the monsoon fell in this valley. At last we came to a village, but everyone fled at our approach, and we could get no information about the route. A little further on, we came across more villages, in one of which, with much difficulty and after a long chase, we captured a man and made him guide us to the village of Chulungfu, where we decided to stop the night. After a little time, we induced some of the villagers to come out from their hiding places and to produce tents and fuel for us. The camp was pitched in a field of sweet-scented primulas near the village. The architecture of these houses was quite different from what we had met before. They all appear to be strongly fortified, as they have practically no windows and there are only small loopholes facing outwards. They are all built of a brown stone, a kind of gneiss, and have sods on the parapet, over which are laid branches of juniper. The next morning we woke to the sound of pattering rain and found all the hills wreathed in gray mist. This was their first rain this year, so the inhabitants told us. It was pleasant to one's skin, after the dry climate and biting winds that we had been experiencing on the other side of the passes, to feel oneself wrapped in a softer and milder air. We rode down this valley for about 6 miles until it debouched into the main Aran Valley. The people, however, do not know it by this name here, but call it still the Bong Chu until it reaches Nepal. We passed villages all the way, villages brown in color and built of a brown gneiss, around which grew fields of barley and mustard. After the barren valleys which we had left, these appeared very fertile. Rose and currant bushes surrounded every field, while the hillsides were covered with juniper and willows. Along the path grew spireas and clematis, while beside every watercourse were yellow marsh marigolds and primulas. A feature of the Aran Valley, which was fairly wide here, was the old terraces on its slopes, now all covered with barley, pea, and mustard fields, the latter being a blaze of yellow. There were many villages here, and some pleasant country houses surrounded by groves of willows and poplars. Down here, the people were not quite so frightened of us as they were in the valley from which we had just come, where they had run away from us whenever we approached. The Bongchu here is a large river with a very great flow of water and quite unfordable. The nearest place where it could be crossed is at a rope bridge some 18 miles higher up, and during the rainy season this bridge is impassable and communication with the other side completely cut off. To the south and close by, at a height of 12,000 feet, the Bongchu enters a terrific gorge, on either side of which tower up great cliffs with snowy peaks high above them. On some of the slopes, which are not quite so steep, there are thick forests of fir trees and rhododendrons, where, I was told, the musk deer lived. After descending the valley for 3 miles, we turned up a side valley pointing westwards. Down this flowed a very large and unfordable glacial stream. This evidently came down from the neighborhood of Mount Everest, but local information as to its source was very vague, and it was evident that we should have to prospect for ourselves. Some 3 miles up this valley we came to a place called by the natives Karta Shika, where the governor of the Karta district resides. Karta was not apparently a village at all, but a district including a number of small villages. We halted a short distance below Kartashika, and presently the governor came out to meet us with a present of sweetmeats and the usual scarf. He apologized for not meeting us before, as he said that he had no information as to the date of our arrival. He begged that we would come over to his garden, where he had ordered a fine Chinese tent to be pitched for us. We crossed the river by a wooden bridge, and after going through the village came to the governor's house. Crossing through the courtyard, we entered his garden, which lay in a nice sheltered spot surrounded by willow trees, with a stream of clear water running through it. Big wild roses grew there, and a few European flowers that he had planted, while under a very ancient poplar there was a large painted prayer wheel some 8 feet high, which was turned by a stream of water. Here in his garden he provided us with a meal of excellent macaroni and a very hot chili salad. It was very pleasant to rest the eyes on the luscious green of the well-irrigated garden, and to be, for once, sheltered from the wind. During the night we were awakened by a regular shower bath. The Chinese tent, beautiful as it was in outward appearance, was sadly lacking in waterproof qualities. As it rained steadily most of the night, we had to take cover under our mackintoshes, on which were pools of water in the morning. There seemed to be no doubt that the proper monsoon had at last broken, and the Zhongpen himself told us that this was the first really heavy rain that they had had. All the people considered that we had brought the rain with us, and were very grateful in consequence. Later on, when we left, they begged us not to stop the rain, as they wanted it badly for their crops. As it cleared up a little about 9 o'clock in the morning, though the hills were still all in cloud, we rode out with Chetan Wangdi, the Zhongpen, and Hopafema, who was the largest landowner about there, to look out for a site for our next base camp. We wanted, if possible, to get a house that could be used as a storeroom and also for photographic purposes. We rode down into the main valley, and after looking over several houses, we eventually selected one on an old river terrace with fine views all around and standing quite by itself well away from any village. The water supply was good and handy, and there was a pleasant garden of poplars and willows in which we could pitch our tents. After a certain amount of bargaining, the owners were willing to let us have the house and the garden for the large rent of 1 trunca or 3.5 pence per day. It was apparently the first time anyone in that valley had ever wanted to rent a house, and there were no house agents there to run one up into exorbitant prices. We then rode on to Hopafema's house, which was a fine, solidly built dwelling surrounded by large juniper trees, willows, and poplars. Later on, we got to know this man very well, and used to call him always the sergeant, as he was supposed to do any recruiting for the Tibetan army that was needed in that valley. He had a very kindly disposition, was always very hospitable, and had a great sense of humor. He had a tent pitched for our reception under a very old poplar, with a grass plot in front surrounded by bushes of wild red roses. Here we were given tea, milk, and beer, and then the usual macaroni and mince was produced. On leaving, he insisted on my taking away a large quantity of turnip leaves, as he knew I was very fond of green food, and they made an excellent spinach. The Tibetans that we met have invariably proved very kindly and hospitable. On returning to Karta, where I had left Heron, I found that it had been raining all the time, though in the main valley we had had it quite fine. In the evening, I took a walk up to an old fort not far from our camp. This fort in old days had commanded the only path from here that led into Nepal, but now it had all fallen into ruin. Close by it, however, was a delightful dell full of hoary willow trees, underneath which the ground was carpeted with yellow primulas growing among the bushes of scarlet roses. Nearby were 2 old poplar trees, whose trunks measured between 20 and 30 feet in circumference, and were evidently of a very great age. The primulas everywhere were really astonishing. They outlined every watercourse with yellow, and often grew between 2 and 3 feet high, with enormous heads of sweet, cowslip-scented yellow flowers. It rained again during the whole of the night, and the fine spray that came through the Chinese tent made sleep rather difficult. The next morning we started to go back to Tingri, and for the first day's march were given porters for our transport. In this district, porters are used a great deal, as all the trade with Nepal has to be carried on by them, the paths over the passes being quite impassable for pack transport. The Jongpen told us that we would find them quite as fast as ponies. Today's march was to Lume, a distance of about 17 miles, and the porters arrived very soon after we did, having come along extraordinarily well. Our route for the first 3 miles was down the Karta Valley until it joined the valley of the Bong Chu. We then followed the right bank of this for some 10 miles. On the way, we stopped at the house of Hopafema, who insisted on giving us a meal of milk, macaroni, and mince, although it was only just over an hour since we had had breakfast. On our departure, he gave us a basket of eggs and some more turnip leaves to take along with us, and altogether showed himself a most friendly and hospitable host. At first, we rode through fields of barley, peas, and mustard for several miles. The valley then became much more barren, and the path occasionally was taken high up on the face of a cliff, where the river swept round close beneath the mountainside. At other times, we crossed broad, stony terraces. We came eventually to the village of Dak, where the monks from the monastery had pitched tents for us and had another meal provided for us. Porters had to be changed here, our old porters arriving while we were having our meal. After the loads had been transferred, our new transport proceeded along to Lume, where we intended to spend the night. The path after Dak was in places dangerous owing to falling stones, and our guide every now and then urged us to hurry, as owing to the heavy rain of the preceding night, many stones had been loosened. The main Bong Chu suddenly turned off to the east from here, unexpectedly forcing a passage through a very curious and deep gorge, where it burst its way through the highest mountains. We did not, however, follow the valley of the Bong Chu, but kept on up what appeared to be the main valley. This was really only the valley of the lower Rongbuk, that in its lower portion is called the Zakar Chu. This river we crossed by a wooden bridge built on the cantilever principle, and which a couple of months later was washed away. After riding for a couple of miles over a nice grassy turf, we came to Lume. Here was a very fine country house around which were grouped a few smaller houses. This was the residence of Gawang Yonten, who was managing the district for the big monastery at Shekarzong, whose property it was. He had tents already pitched for us, and fuel, milk, and eggs already prepared. Around this house were 5 of the largest poplar trees that I had ever seen. The largest was almost 40 feet in circumference at the base, and the others were all between 20 and 25 feet in circumference. The villagers told us that they thought these trees had been planted about 500 years ago. Magpies and hoopoes were very common in this valley. The former were quite tame and allowed us to approach very close. The barley fields seemed to hold many hares. Some fine crops of wheat as well as barley were grown here, although the height was 12,800 feet. Every night now we had heavy rain, which brought fresh snow down to 16,000 feet. As the clouds remained low all day, we seldom got any distant views. The march to Pulme, our next point up the valley of the Zakarchu, was 22 miles, a very dull and uninteresting ride. The going was bad. We often had to follow the bed of the river, which was now in flood and extended to the cliffs on both sides. At other times we kept high up on the steep sides of a gorge, sometimes of gneiss, sometimes of limestone rock. In places where the valley widened out, the riverbed was full of bushes of tamarisk and sea buckthorn, but otherwise the vegetation was scanty. After going 15 miles, we were to change porters, but the Lume porters, who were extremely poor and very different from those that we had taken from Karta, took 11 hours to cover the 15 miles, and did not arrive till 6 in the evening. Much to Heron's disgust, I proposed to push on to Pulme, late as it was, but the road was good, and we trotted the 7 miles in an hour and a half, though the porters and the donkeys did not arrive till well after dark. Fortunately, we found tents as usual pitched for our reception. We had originally intended to ford the Zakarchu that evening and camp on the far side, but it was too dangerous to do it in the dark, though the villagers told us that by morning the stream would be a couple of feet higher. The river is a great obstacle at this time of the year, as there is no bridge over it here, the next bridge being at Chobu, 20 miles higher up the valley. The following day I started on my return journey to Tingri, leaving at 5:30 in the morning with Chetan Wangdi. I succeeded in fording the Zakarchu, which was deep and very swift. My pony was swept off his legs once, and I got very wet, the icy cold water coming right over the saddle. Heron and the porters were to follow on slowly, and were to take 2 days in reaching Tingri, but I was anxious to get back, having been away already longer than I intended. 4 miles away at Tashizome, I changed ponies and procured a guide who was to take me on to Tingri, leaving Chetan Wangdi behind with Heron. This guide proved quite an amusing fellow, and suddenly surprised me by counting in English 1, 2, 3, 4, and then saying right turn and left turn and other military words of command. On inquiring where he had learned this English, I found that at one time he had served as a soldier at Lhasa, where the military words of command are in English, and these were the only English words that he knew. After leaving Tashizome, we turned up into a broad side valley with villages every half-mile, and surrounded by barley, mustard, and pea fields. What was, however, especially noticeable about all these valleys that we had been passing through for the last 2 days was the extraordinary number of ruined villages that there were everywhere. This was not due to lack of water, for there was plenty of water in all the streams. These valleys, however, must have at one time been very thickly inhabited, and it is probable that the dearth of population today is due to the wars with the Gurkhas in the 18th century. We had a very wet ride. One storm after another overtook us, and a cold rain fell heavily all the way to Tingri. We gradually ascended out of the cultivation, and crossing a low pass about 16,000 feet, looked down again on the great Tingri plain. There was still, however, a long way to go, and it was not till after 5 o'clock in the evening that I reached Tingri, drenched to the skin. It had been a ride of between 36 and 40 miles. At Tingri I found Wollaston and Moorshead. The former had been very busy all the time I had been away in collecting insects, butterflies, rats, mice, birds, and flowers, and had amassed quite a number of specimens. Moorshead had been out a good deal with his surveyors to the north and to the west, but had been driven in by the bad weather of the last few days. This had apparently been general, and we might say that the rainy season this year had begun on July 7th, which the Tibetans considered very late for those parts. The following afternoon, Heron arrived, and my kit also, which I was very glad to get, as I had only had a spare tent to roll around me the previous night. The next day or two was spent mostly in reading letters and newspapers. Our postal arrangements were at first rather complicated, there being no regular postal service to the provinces in Tibet. We had therefore to make an arrangement with each Jongpen to forward on our mail. Fari was the last post office, and the postmaster there had to arrange with the Fari Jongpen for a messenger every week to go with our post to Kambajong. We had left money for him for the purpose of paying the postman. At Kambajong we had arranged with the Jongpen there that he should forward our letters to Tingki. And at Tingki we had made further arrangements for them to be sent on to Shekarzong, and from Shekarzong they were to be sent to Tingri. We had left money for this purpose with the various Jongpens, and each Jongpen as he received the mail bag was to affix his seal on it and send it on as quickly as he could to the next. This system worked very well for the first 2 months, but after we had moved to Karta, partly owing to floods, and partly perhaps to the laziness of the Shekar Jongpen, our mails were all held up, and we eventually had to send porters back from our camp to Fari to bring them along. The best plan another time would be to take with the expedition a certain number of porters, to be used purely for going backwards and forwards with the mails. On July 13th, Moorshead and Wollaston left to go to Nyenyam, in response to a cordial invitation from the Jongpen, asking that some of the expedition should visit the place. We were glad to accept, as this should be a very interesting part of the country botanically. Chapter 6. The Move to Karta. I had arrived back at Tingri on July 11th and remained there in the Chinese rest house until July 24th, when I started to move the base camp and all the stores round to Karta. During the time, I was not left always alone, for Heron came in occasionally for a night between his various geological expeditions to the north. Wheeler also came down for a change and a rest, and to develop the photographs that he had taken. He had been having a very trying and provoking time in the high camps, as the weather had been bad with frequent snowfalls. Nearly every day he climbed up to a spur 20,000 feet or more in height, yet in spite of waiting all day there in the icy cold winds or driving snow, it was but seldom that he was able to get a photograph, and then the clouds would only lift for a few minutes. There was always plenty to do at Tingri, so the time passed quickly. Much photographic work had to be done, and much developing and printing of the many photographs that were being sent in by the various members of the party. Supplies had also to be sent out, and arrangements made for the comforts of the climbing party in the Rongbuk Valley. There were also several expeditions to be made round Tingri, and these were full of interest. Anemometers were very popular in this district. They were fixed by the Tibetans above small prayer wheels, and owing to the constant winds, it was seldom that the prayer wheels were not revolving. Many yak's horns, carved all over with prayers, were lying about on the different chortens or mani walls. The barley, which was only just coming up when we arrived, was now 18 inches high and coming into ear, and though we were over 14,000 feet, the crops looked very healthy and even. Every evening during this period, we had heavy storms of rain, with much lightning and thunder, and fresh snow used to fall during the night as low as 15,000 feet, but most of it melted again during the day. During this period, the plains round Tingri were rapidly becoming marshes and the rivers quite unfordable. The storms always gathered to the north of us, along the Cyprian limestone ridge and the high mountain chain that formed the watershed between the Brahmaputra and the Bongchu. These storms generally worked down towards the south. Occasionally fine days came to us when there was a strong south wind to blow the rain back, and it was seldom that the monsoon clouds brought rain directly to us from the south. The Cypri Range was a very conspicuous limestone range to the north of us, the limestone being worn into the most curious shapes. It was looked upon by the Tibetans as being a holy mountain, and on its slopes were many small monasteries. Hermits also took up their abode in the limestone caves below the summit. Pilgrims used to come from great distances to make the circuit of the mountain. This took generally 5 days, and much merit was acquired by doing so. On July 17th, I made an excursion out to the hot springs at Samda, about 7 miles away to the northwest across the plain. The valley of the Bongchu narrows there for a few miles before opening out again into the wide Sutso plain. There were 2 or 3 hot springs here, but only one large one, and this was enclosed by walls within which were little stone huts, in which people could change their clothes. The water was just the right temperature for a nice hot bath. When I went there, there was one man bathing and also washing his clothes in it. The Tibetans said, however, that this was not the proper season for bathing. The autumn was the correct time for them to have their annual bath before the winter sets in. The water was saline and had, I think, a little iron in it, but was not very unpleasant to the taste. The rocks from which it gushes out are very extraordinary, the strata forming a very steep arch, on the top of which there is a crack, from the very end of which, at its lowest point, the springs came bubbling out. Nearby in the valley, there were also a good many saline deposits. In one of the smaller springs, there were a number of little pink worm-like animals that were swimming about and clinging with their mouths to the sides of the rock. Riding back to Tingri by a different way across the plain, I saw a number of kiang and a few goa, but they were very wild and would not allow us to approach to within 500 yards. I also passed 3 of the handsome black-necked cranes. The way across the plain was rather boggy, and we had some difficulty in finding it. When I got back, I found that Heron had come in for a couple of nights, and the following day Wheeler too joined us, having walked in from Nizogu, the bridge over the Kitrak River. He was anxious to develop some photographs, and as the weather was very bad, he could do no good by remaining in his high camp. On July 20th, we had very brilliant flashes of lightning, followed by a heavy storm of rain during the night. This was too much for the flat earth roof of the rest house, and the water poured into all our rooms, causing us to move our beds many times during the night in search of a dry spot. I started off early in the morning, as I had intended to climb the hills to the east of Tingri, but the rain that had fallen at Tingri had meant a heavy fall of snow on the mountains, and the snow had fallen as low down as 15,000 feet. We passed several Goa on the way, but they were too shy to allow us to get a shot. And also some kyong, which were very tame and showed up well in the snow. As we got higher, the snow became about 4 inches deep, but was melting rapidly. The glare and the heat were intense. I saw a good many flocks of burrell, but no very large heads. The views as I followed the crests of the hills were extremely fine. On the north, I looked down into the valley of the Bong Chu, which was in flood and had filled the whole of the bottom of the valley with water. And on the other side I looked over the Tingri Plain to the great range of snow peaks which finally ended in the mighty mass of Gosaintan. The weather had been very hot and oppressive all day, and as usual in the evening we had another very severe thunderstorm with heavy rain all through the night. The following day was more like an English November day, cold and gray with drizzling rain, and with the snow on the hills down to 15,000 feet. I bought a Tibetan pony during the morning for the large sum of £7. It was a bay, an excellent ambler and very sure-footed. The Tibetan name by which he was known was Dugdra Kyungpo, which means the bay pony like a dragon. I went over to have lunch with the Depon's representative. His family were all dressed up very smartly for the occasion, the women folk wearing their best headdresses of turquoises, coral, and pearls. He gave us rice and raisins as an hors d'oeuvre, and an entree of junket, followed by some pickled turnips, which I thought very nasty, after which we had the usual macaroni and mince. He had been very friendly and kindly to us the whole time that we were at Tingri, and had always supplied us with everything we asked for. On July 22nd, we saw a very fine solar halo with well-marked rings of yellow, brown, green, and white, but the rain continued steadily nearly all the time. The day before we were to leave Tingri, I sent away my orderly, together with 2 porters who had been sick and whom the doctor had recommended that we should send back to Darjeeling. They were given sufficient food to take them back to Darjeeling, and an extra 15 days' pay, the orderly also being given a horse to ride. Towards evening, the weather improved, and we had some lovely views of Mount Everest, and that great group of snow peaks of which Cho Uyo is the highest. They all looked very white under their new coating of snow, which lies thickly down to 16,000 feet. On July 24th, we eventually got off from Tingri. The last few days had been spent in packing up and rearranging all the stores. There was the usual talking, shouting, and arguing, but all the loads were eventually packed onto the animals or loaded onto the backs of the porters by 9 o'clock. We then took a last farewell of the Depon's representative, who was very sorry to see us go, and who had done so much to make our stay pleasant there. And before we set off on yet another trek, I think we'll end this evening's reading from Mount Everest, the Reconnaissance of 1921, which remains an absolutely fascinating read. I can understand why so many of you enjoy this one. It's filled with wonderful images, sure to make the most beautiful dreams, and I hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like to read this work for yourself and see the photographs it contains, which I recommend you do as they're very interesting, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.